Welcome back to Transportal CFB podcast YouTube channel presented by NoContextCFB. We're back with our weekly offseason podcast episode coming to you every Wednesday as we look forward to the 2023 season. My name is Parker Gillen. I'm going to have to stop this right now because I'm going to have to ask you how to pronounce your name or last name. I just realized that, and I was not going to do it right the first time.
Oh man, let me hear what you were gonna say.
Ruben King. I mean,
Okay, yep, that's it.
yeah. Oh, it is? Okay, sweet. I didn't know if maybe
Yeah,
like
just
end
like the
silent, if
sandwich.
it wasn't just straight up Ruben. All right, cool. All right, we'll restart that. I noticed as soon as it said host name, I was like, wait. All right.
That's funny. I appreciate you not stumbling over that.
Yeah, I figured I might as well just cut my losses. Okay. All right, 3, 2, 1. All right, welcome back to the Transportal CFB podcast YouTube channel presented by NoContextCFB. We're here with our weekly offseason episode coming to you every Wednesday as we look forward to the 2023 season. My name is Parker Gillen, and joining me today we have Dylan Rubenking. Dylan, how you doing?
Doing well, man. It's been a while since I've been on a podcast, I think. Working on the magazine, there's so much going on, so much craziness every week. So I'm happy to be able to hop on with you. This is the first time I've done a podcast with you.
Yeah, I think it's my fourth and fifth. I mean, I've enjoyed it every time. I've been with different people each time, which has also been something I like for sure. But yeah, so kind of today we're gonna go into a lot of the recent Pac-12 media rights news and kind of all that's going on with that, the future of the conference and what kind of lies in store for some of the teams in it. And then also just talk about the overall remaining teams that are kind of quote unquote uncommitted to a conference or just maybe looking to make moves in the recent years. And then we're going to go through some hypotheticals, some what we think are more likely to happen in the 2023 season. But first, just want to go ahead and quickly shout out again, July 5th, first ever edition of the Transportal CFB preview magazine will be out. It's a digital PDF sold for $9.99. And we're going to have in-depth previews of all FBS conferences and teams, 20 plus player focus articles, 10 feature pieces, and then also just some classic preview magazine content, Heisman watch lists, All-America teams, bowl projections, etc. And for instance, I was going to go ahead and reveal here. I've got a piece on a Sacramento State transferred to Arizona State, joining up with Kenny Dillingham, Cameron Scatabo. I've got a piece as one of those player focused pieces in there, and really, he was a really good interview, a really fun guy. So definitely check that out when it's available on July 5th. But yeah, don't forget to give us a like and subscribe here on YouTube, and leave a comment or 5-star review on Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok, and those are all kind of in the description below. And just again, thank you everyone for your support as we kind of grow our team and our content and get this magazine coming out. So, but yeah, let's kind of get into the show. The question of the day is the Pac-12, is their grave already dug? Are they on the way out? Obviously, ESPN recently announced that they're kind of out on the media rights deal. Conference has been struggling for months to really find someone to partner up with. I mean, it's almost become kind of a joke of sorts, who they've been reaching out to and who's kind of denied them. And now they're kind of stuck in an in-between phase with USC and UCLA on the way out. So, I mean, what do you kind of think these next couple of years are going to look like for the Pac-12?
Well, I mean, who really knows at this point? It's so up in the air with what the Pac-12 is going to do because, there was the ESPN Fox stuff, right? Are they going to go back to them? Is ESPN Fox still interested? That was the biggest thing because ESPN has been turning out a lot of different things. And so it wasn't really a surprise that the Pac-12 was not really on their radar. I don't want to say not on their radar, but was not necessarily a priority for them to keep. Fox has got the big noon kickoff, the Big Ten covered. I think those two channels will probably be fine without the Pac-12. Now, for me, the Pac-12 football landscape this season is going to be really hard for some networks to miss because there's so much high talent, especially at quarterback. All the stars in that league. There's as many stars in that league as there are in any college football Power Five conference. And so to me, I think it's interesting that that's not a selling point for ESPN and for Fox. And the fact that they might have to stoop to like an Apple TV or a Peacock or something like that. Like it boggles my mind that that's where we are now. And, the Pac-12, there's obviously been so much, like you said, jokes and kind of memes about it, especially during the Larry Scott days of, the league being on its way out. Having USC and UCLA on the way out doesn't look good. And the thing is, we'll get into it a little bit, but the whole realignment thing, like where are they going to go there? It feels like the talks are kind of dying, but that also could be because they're trying to focus on getting that media rights deal down for the coming years as it expires. I believe is it this summer or is it next summer?
I believe I want to say this summer, but I'm not positive. Can I can look into it
Yeah.
real quick.
Yeah, so I mean, the whole realignment thing, they need to get that figured out because there are a couple of teams, namely SMU and San Diego State, I think should be at the
Mhm.
top of their priority, especially with San Diego State basketball, the run that they just had.
Yeah,
The football's been pretty consistent. SMU, it's a huge, huge market that the Pac-12 could definitely use. Um, so I don't know, man. I really hate to think of a world where the Pac-12 is streaming games on Apple
mhm,
TV or Peacock, whatever it is. I just it makes too much sense though for it to be the Pac-12 to be the first to do that because they have
yeah,
the Pac-12 network that's the ever elusive Pac-12 network. It feels like
mhm,
anybody I talk to is like, yeah, I don't have it. I can't watch those games. So,
yep,
I feel like Apple TV is probably the most realistic thing at this point. But as for realignment, I really don't know. But I will say ESPN and Fox, I think they're going to be missing out in the coming years because of all the star talent that's coming into the Pac-12 and is currently in the Pac-12.
yeah, yeah. I was about to say, growing up a Georgia or an Oregon fan in Georgia was it. I had no hope of getting Pac-12 network. I'll put it that way. But yeah, I mean, I think that is. I mean, we've kind of talked about a lot of the issues. I mean, it was just the way they marketed themselves, the way they branded these past couple of years. I mean, I look back at, I mean, Christian McCaffrey's season in which he should have won the Heisman. You can I would at least I can argue with Derrick Henry fans all day long. I if he played in the SEC, if he played East Coast football, he would have won that. But that's just an example. And I like your point about the star talent that they have this year. It's going to be very difficult to avoid that because you've got, I mean, between the quarterbacks in the conference, you could have two, maybe even three Heisman finalists if they play up to kind of how you would expect. And how are you going to avoid that? And maybe if Apple TV Plus is going to be, loving it because everybody's going to be subscribing because those are going to be some of the biggest games of the season. Because that's, I mean, USC, Washington, Oregon, they all kind of play each other this year. Utah as well, and there's some other decent teams kind of in the mix now. It's ironic that this might be the best Pac-12 football season you could argue in the past decade, maybe in terms of top to bottom talent and the teams that they have, and it's coming at a time in which their popularity, at least kind of nationally, they're treated kind of as a joke, and so it's interesting. And you did mention or include the statistic about kind of how they had a record in revenue in 21 through 22, and it was, I mean, still much lower than Big Ten, SEC, ACC, but it's a sign that things are going in the right direction. It's just is the conference going to be able to grab this momentum and be able to work with it? So I agree with you that San Diego State a good target. I've always thought Boise as well, even though it seems like something has to have happened there in the past to where they haven't even there's been no rumors reaching out to them, at least mainstream. So it'll be interesting. And personally, I've kind of given up hope. I think the conference will disband in probably next 2, 3, 4 years, and it'll be Oregon and Washington leaving. I would imagine that kind of triggers that, but we'll see. I mean, maybe they'll hang tough and the conference will stay together. It'll be because it would be tough to not have a conference that identifies with the West Coast anymore. And I think college football, college basketball will be losing something with that.
Yeah, and I think with college football, especially, we talked about the star power. And by the way, the media rights deal ends next summer, July 1st,
Mm,
2024.
okay.
So I think with college football, especially, you look at head to toe, there's, I would say, 10 teams that could be bowl teams this year. I
Mhm,
think Stanford and Cal are the only two where I think the potential could be, 7-5, 6-6, but I'm not ready to make that bet yet.
mhm,
We forgot to talk about Colorado with Deion
yeah.
Sanders and that whole, crazy circus show that is going to definitely drive in a lot of ratings for one name alone, I think. Um, and then obviously USC, the brand is back there. Oregon has a massive brand. Washington's got a massive brand. UCLA is on the way out. Um, and like you said, the record speaks for themselves that they made, I think it was $580 million, as a conference in revenue. And that's across all sports, of course. And then men's basketball this year, you got Bronny going to USC.
Mhm,
That's kind of the big thing. UCLA is still obviously going to be one of the best teams in the conference, Arizona as well. So, and then, women's basketball has a really good conference, track and field, really good conference. Um, it's surprising to me that it's not the Big 12 that's struggling like this.
Mhm.
And it makes me think that it's a big deal of that is the realignment because the Big 12, as soon as Oklahoma and Texas were on the way out, and everybody was talking about the Big 12. Oh, they're dead. They're going to disband. Who's going where? Who's taking what scraps? They went out and got four new teams, and they look like a completely rebuilt, revamped conference that should excite a lot of people. And the Pac-12 is just kind of sputtering. So I think the market for the Pac-12 is there. I think the potential to add even bigger markets is there. I think that you talked about Boise State. I think that's an academic thing because the Pac-12 is
Mhm.
pretty heavy on academics and meeting certain requirements, having a certain ranking. And I
Mhm.
don't believe Boise State is in that realm.
Yeah.
But I think SMU would be good for, I think the football product, maybe not as much, but in terms of academics and the TV market, that's a huge hit for
Mhm.
them if they can get that. San Diego, same thing. That's a big market. Staying in Southern California. And then obviously the basketball product, the football product exists there too. So I don't know, man. I think Apple, the whole thing with Apple and streaming in general, this is probably not the best example, but I think of like my mom watches a lot of soap operas and they
Mhm.
moved all that stuff to like Peacock or HBO Max or whatever. And that whole demographic got pissed because they're like, I don't know how to access this. But that's a much older demographic than
Yeah.
probably what the Pac-12 is reaching. But you're losing a chunk of that because of people who, either can't afford it or can't find it, outside of the cable networks. So I don't know. It feels like if it happens, it might fall apart. If they jump into streaming.
Yeah, I think so. I do like your point about the Big 12, and I just think when we look back 10, 15, 20 years from now, we're going to look at the Big 12 in being they were the most proactive conference when the realignment, the dominoes started falling. They were the one that said, "No, we are going to hold on." The Pac-12 kind of sat back and waited. The ACC is in a little bit different scenario, but they've kind of sat back and waited, and both those conferences might end up getting kind of screwed over just because they're kind of late to the game. So it'll be interesting to see how that works out. A lot of credit does go to the Big 12 for kind of how they handled that and if they can pull some of these teams away. And I also, the point about the markets, you lose LA pretty much as a whole with USC and UCLA. San Diego, Dallas could be huge markets that you could bring into the mix. Dallas would be a whole, you could get access to Texas through there. And then you'd have, what would that be? That'd be the Big 12, SEC, Pac 12 having teams in Texas, probably a group of five conferences. That would be so many conferences dipping into Texas and the media and recruiting there, which would be, that would be a battlefield for sure. But yeah, I think, and you also pointed out how a lot of these Colorado's on the rise. USC's brand is back. Oregon recently, Dan Lanning is recruiting like a maniac, and he's somehow, at least in my eyes, he somehow made that place even more, quote unquote cool, or just a more desirable destination than it even was when peak Chip Kelly era. You could argue, just in terms of what they're pulling in and how the recruits are talking and the kind of atmosphere around the program. So they're another one kind of on their way up. Washington as well. So yeah, kind of transitioning with kind of these groups of teams that are, not necessarily in the age of realignment, not necessarily locked into a conference right now, or at least kind of shopping around. Who is kind of the most valuable program remaining? You're looking at Oregon, Notre Dame, Washington. Technically, you're also looking at those seven ACC schools that said they're about to try to get out of there. Notre Dame's program that's always seemed like they know that they hold the dominoes and they're gonna bide their time and wait until someone comes crawling to them, which we'll see if it works out. I feel like they might end up getting burned in the end too. But yeah, who do you think if you're a commissioner of a conference that you're looking at and saying they're going to add the most, success in the field, revenue, media, etc.
I think from head to toe, when you talk about the brand, when you talk about, winning in sports, when you talk about all those different things, I honestly think it should be Oregon. But something tells me that Notre Dame, like you said, they hold the domino. They kind of have, first dibs at that because they're already in a conference and a couple of sports. The football independence is. I feel like everybody's just waiting for that to end at some point.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like Notre Dame is either going to be in the ACC or maybe a Big Ten school. at some point. But for me, I think Oregon across all sports, you really look at the landscape, especially in the last decade. Oregon's built its brand, I would argue, as fast as anybody has
Mhm.
at the Power Five level, especially with football. You know, men's basketball made it to the Final Four, women's basketball made it to the Final Four, one of the best track and field programs in the country. I think you would gain a lot from bringing in Oregon. You know, talking about the Big 12 or the Big 10 is probably the two most realistic ones.
Mhm.
Um, and then obviously, you know, having a Pacific Northwest and the ability that those coaches at Oregon have to recruit all over the country. Like you said, Dan Lanning and his staff can go into any living room and recruit anybody. And I think that's something that has Oregon has never really been able to do pre Chip Kelly, I'd say. Even during the Chip Kelly era, that wasn't really a thing that he was doing. I don't think that really started until Cristobal and Willie Taggart, I'd probably say. Sorry
Mhm.
for Oregon fans to bring that name back up, but Notre Dame, though, I think the brand for the national championship pedigree for football, especially, I think that's the biggest draw for me. But we can't sleep on Washington because that is a massive market in Seattle. That's also a really big brand, and the recruiting is only going to get better. But I think from head to toe, as you talked about, I think Oregon is probably the most valuable one right now. I think historically, though, you have to say Notre Dame.
Yeah, I do think, I mean, face value, I think most people are looking at Notre Dame and just saying, we're immediately getting more attention and just more eyes on games. The team ratings are going to go up. Just because I think, I mean, there's also, I've always at least thought that in college athletics, there is an East Coast bias, and Notre Dame is not East Coast technically, but they're an eastern side of the country. Not as many diehard college football fans care about Oregon as they do Notre Dame at the end of the day, for the most part. So, but yeah, I think, I mean, the trajectory that all these programs are on, I think Kalen DeBoer is going to be at Washington for a long time, and I think he's going to have that program consistently top 20 in the country. I also look at top to bottom. I think out of those ACC schools, they're a little bit different scenario. They're going to have to work through a lot of the contracts and stuff like that. In my opinion, I think they're going to before 2036 because they're probably just going to need to with how the Big Ten and SEC are kind of accelerating the process. But I like Florida State probably the most of those ACC schools just because basketball program had a down year last year. Usually, definitely up there. Football obviously is a sleeping giant that might be awakening this year. And I just think, I mean, the talent that's down there, and you've got, I mean, it's a respected university, so, but you really can't go wrong with Clemson. I think Miami's one of those wild cards that it's just like, if they ever reach their potential, if they can do, I compare Miami a lot to like Tennessee, and Tennessee finally turned it around this last year, and seems like they are going to continue that. Miami seemed like they turned that corner in 2017, I believe it was that 12-0 season, or at least they started out, but seemed like it didn't happen. So we'll have to see. I do agree. I think Notre Dame's going to be at least the most highly pursued. Everybody believes they belong in the Big Ten from what it seems like. I can't imagine them going anywhere else. It's just there are already some rivalries there. Regionally, it makes sense. That seems pretty set in stone. I am interested to hear your take as well, though, on Oregon and Washington, where they are more likely to end up. I'm thinking as of right now, Big 12, because if the Big Ten goes after Notre Dame, they're probably, unless they pair them with Oregon, I think they're probably going to look elsewhere along there. So I would think Big 12 is right now. But yeah, what are your thoughts?
Well, you also have to think about there's a potential, you know, the masochism word, I guess, would be, you know, just creating one giant merging conference, you know, between whatever the Pac-12 and Big 12 or, you know, however that works. You know, that's definitely a realistic option that I think people have to keep in mind because of what the SEC is probably going to keep doing. I know they're bringing in Oklahoma and Texas. I don't feel like they're done. But I think realistically for Oregon and Washington, yeah, I agree with you. I think the Big 12 is probably the most realistic thing. You talked about the market and how there's an East Coast bias or even a Southern bias with college football, especially. I think if you put Oregon and Washington, especially in a consistent, let's say 6 o'clock Central Time, 7 o'clock Central Time at the latest time slot, I think Oregon and Washington's brands will absolutely balloon across the country
Mhm.
because that's kind of always been kind of the thing against them, the knock against those teams is that they're playing at 10 o'clock Eastern time, 10:30 Eastern time. Um, and people just don't want to stay up that late. But if you put them in, against the Oklahomas, against Texas, or I guess they're on the way out. So more so like Oklahoma State and Baylor, Houston, UCF. They're not going to be playing those super late night games as often. I would assume that games at home for Oregon and Washington would still be later than some of the other Big 12 schools would be. But I do think that they would have more often than not a start that's probably 6:30, 7 o'clock Central Time that would fit a lot of Big 12 fans, in the Texas area, in the Florida area now with UCF coming in. And so I think that would be a big win. Like you said, Big Ten, I think the Big Ten is going to be fine. Even if they don't get Notre Dame, I think they'll be fine. But I do think that's a realistic possibility that they bring them in. And I don't think they really need Oregon and Washington unless they just want to go crazy and try to,
Yeah.
top the SEC.
It is essentially an arms race at this point between the SEC and the Big Ten. That is how I see it. And I mean, yeah, they're probably going to keep trying just to keep one upping each other for these next couple of years. But yeah, I think my one kind of concern out of that is, will we lose some of the thrill of the Pac-12 after dark though if they do change up some of those times? And I think that's more. If anything, the Pac-12 after dark is usually better when it's 2, 5, and 4 teams and they go to triple overtime. Honestly, so maybe the top teams not playing then will be fine, but yeah, I do think, having better time slots will definitely help them out, a lot. And that's an interesting conversation. I would be intrigued to see kind of what, athletic departments say about how do you balance when you're a West Coast team like that, balance wanting to have home games that are at decent times, for where East Coast people can watch, with also still wanting to provide your university with nighttime football games, which are, according to pretty much everybody, more fun than, noon, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock kickoffs. Where do the priorities lie there between kind of, I mean, valuing your student body and your fan base versus exposure for your football team and your program? That'd be something I'd just be interested to see kind of what they value more. I would imagine that money speaks in that scenario more, but you have to give your students at least some night home games. I mean, take it from me who goes to Missouri and they rarely get nighttime. Last season they at least got a couple, but it is tough to be up at 11 a.m. and wanting to, really get going for a game.
Well, yeah, think about Oregon at UCF in the bounce house. Are you kidding
Mhm.
me? Dude, that's a night
So
game.
fun.
Oh my goodness, man. That's absolutely insane. But the thing you also have to keep in mind is, it's going to be the same conversation with USC and UCLA is, the fan bases. Are they going to be willing to make those treks and
Mhm.
travel out all the way, out to the Midwest and vice versa. Same thing. There's teams in the Midwest and in the East Coast and all that stuff. Are they going to make the trip all the way out to the West Coast? That's something to keep in mind. Recruiting. I think there's ups and downs to recruiting because there are a lot of guys, coming from someone that used to cover recruiting, there are a lot of guys that want to stay close to home. They don't have to be in their state, but they want to make it a drivable distance for, their families, especially. And then when they go on like Christmas break and whatever, they want to be able to go quickly there and back. So I think that's going to be a big thing is, Oregon and Washington in the Big 12, Big 10. Is that gonna hurt some recruiting? Is that gonna hurt some fan turnout, all that sort of stuff? But honestly, I think it's a win-win for Oregon and Washington and the Big 12, top to bottom. With the ratings, with different time zones, all that sort of stuff. I think when you weigh it all together, I think it works well for everybody. But I wouldn't sleep on Colorado
Mhm.
being, a potential team to make that jump to the Big 12 or back to the Big 12 with Deion Sanders. I have a feeling he might want to get them out of the Pac-12. That's just kind of a gut
Yeah.
feeling. That's not really based on any evidence.
Yeah. No, and I would hope at least that they would, if they did make that move, they would try to pair them with Utah, have both the mountain schools, because that's
Right.
one team I haven't heard, at least for me personally, a ton about in these realignment talks. And I feel like they're being overlooked somehow again as a football program when they have been
Always
to the
do.
Rose Bowl each of the past 2 years, which is insane to me. But that's how Kyle Whittingham kind of drives that program forward. So he's probably fine with it. But kind of, yeah, my last thought coming out of this now is if Oregon and Washington, hypothetical, obviously go to the Big 12, how does that Big 12 stack up with the SEC and Big 10? They're not going to be same level revenue wise, media wise, but in terms of actual football, I mean talent. You're going to add Oregon and Washington. You're looking at these current teams in the Big 12. Which of them is TCU going to become a year in, year out power? Can Oklahoma State get back? You would need some other teams to really step up with them. But adding Oregon and Washington, I think you stack up pretty favorably top to bottom with those other two conferences.
Yeah, and I think, teams like BYU, Cincinnati, I think those teams will get back to, their winning ways eventually. I think this year might be a little bit, not just because of the conference realignment, but I think those teams in general are just kind of going through a transition process because of the coaching change football wise. With BYU's defensive coordinator and a lot of roster turnover, Cincinnati, the coaching staff is new. And so I think those teams are ones you have to keep in mind as well. But competing with the SEC, I think it would be as close as it's been in a long time. Because in terms of the money, those two teams were those conferences rather were at the top. Big Ten 845 million, SEC 802 million. A lot of people would assume the SEC would have been on top. I thought they were number one. I think they have been for a while.
Yeah.
But I think in terms of talent football wise, I think SEC would still have the edge as of right now, but I wouldn't put it past the Big Ten to be the Big 12 even to be in that same category of like this is the upper echelon of college football is the Big 12, the Big 10, the SEC. I think the Big 12 could be in that tier eventually. But I definitely think that Oregon and Washington and whoever else that the Big 12 might get, I think that football specifically, that would be the biggest benefit from having Oregon and Washington because of those brands. I think the other sports would help, but I think football wise, if you can add those two brands, those two, you just see those logos everywhere in the Pacific Northwest. You see them outside of the Pacific Northwest. Everybody knows those two schools, those two brands. And I think if you can further that across the country, talent wise, brand wise, that competes with the Big Ten, the Michigans, Ohio State, Penn State, and the same thing with the SEC in Alabama, Georgia, Florida. I still think it would rank probably SEC, Big Ten, Big 12, but the gap wouldn't be
Yeah.
so far apart between the three.
Yeah, because I mean, for the longest time when Oklahoma, Texas, USC, kind of USC, UCLA started uh, agreeing to move to other conferences, people were thinking, all right, Big Ten, SEC, that's our future. There will be no other conferences. The Big 12, as we touched on earlier, they were proactive. They said, we're going to still exist. We might have to bide our time and be in the shadows for a little bit, not be the top dogs, but we're still going to be around. You add Oregon and Washington, that takes that to a next level. And I mean, we are football podcast, but basketball wise, you add Oregon and Washington to a conference that already gets a lot stronger this year from adding Houston. And then Cincinnati, generally a year in, year out solid program, BYU as well. UCF's had some decent years. I think you can make an argument that's the strongest conference in college basketball. If you plug in Oregon, who some down years recently, generally one of those top programs, Washington in a similar place, they've don't have the same pedigree, but I think you've also got a ton of potential in basketball, which will kind of aid those talks too. So, and same Colorado's had a decent team as well if they're looking there. But yeah, I do think I'm interested to see how this plays. It seems like Oregon and Washington on their side are not pushing too much. I imagine there's a decent amount happening behind the scenes that we're not hearing about. But it seems like they're keeping everything kind of hush hush right now. I imagine the conference is going to let this year play out. I mean, obviously try to figure out this media right stuff, but let this year play out. Hopefully you have a great football season. The biggest thing they probably need this year as a conference is one of those teams to make the playoff. They can't, again, just beat themselves up. And unfortunately, they seemingly all play each other. And they've all got pretty tough schedules all around. So it's going to be difficult because it's not going to be a conference where you can lose two games and make it through. I would not imagine unless we get a 2007-esque season of college football, but we'll have to see. But kind of moving on, we had just kind of want to end the episode with some more lighthearted, just some kind of hypotheticals, what we think is more likely to happen for the 2023 season as we kind of enter the dog days summer months of the off season. So first and foremost, two kind of not the top two contenders in their conference, but that third team that's really making a strong push got LSU in the SEC, Penn State in the Big Ten. Who is more likely to win that conference championship?
It's a really good question. I think if I choose Penn State, it's because of the potential. Obviously they won the Rose Bowl last year, but there's still the hump of getting through Michigan and getting through Ohio State. I like their chances to get at least one this year, but I don't know. It's tough because there's so many young guys that have to be the guys now. Drew Aller specifically, but Nick
Mm-hmm.
Singleton proved that he can be the guy. A lot of transfers coming in as well. The defense is loaded. I like their chances as a team, but the top of the conference to me still seems set in stone with Michigan and Ohio State, and same thing with LSU. But nobody thought LSU was going to be the team that they were last year in the year one of Brian Kelly and make the SEC championship game, beat Alabama, not look completely terrible against Georgia. I mean, the final score is probably closer than what it actually was, but I think everybody was predicting Georgia by 40. And LSU put up more of a fight than I thought they would. So, and a lot of those guys come back, Jaden Daniels, Malik Neighbors, Harold Perkins on defense, a lot of guys on defense overall. So to me, I think I have to keep in mind the top of the conference, who has a better chance of getting over that. I think LSU's already proven they can do that. Penn State, not so much yet. So I'm going to go with LSU.
Yeah, I'm pretty much in the same boat. Purely just I Penn State on paper has an amazing team, and I want to pick them, but it's tough. The James Franklin era has been kind of summarized by on paper you have a team that is fully capable, but you're always third fiddle in this scenario to Ohio State, Michigan. They've never, I don't believe that Franklin has been able to beat the two of them in a single season the same year, because that year they went to the Big Ten title, they still lost to Michigan. Um, so yeah, I mean, again, I love on paper. I think that team is phenomenal. I'm going to go on record and say that I'm going to pick them to win the Big Ten, but in terms of confidence, I I like LSU more. Just if I'm going to put money on it, I just think the team top to bottom is loaded. Brian, if anybody's going to march into Tuscaloosa, Alabama on November 4th and win, Brian Kelly's one of those guys that could pull some rabbit out of a hat. It sets up nicely because they have Army October 21st and the bye week, so you really got a pretty light slate looking in. But Florida State game is going to be incredibly tough, and then they still have to go on the road. Ole Miss, Mississippi State, Missouri. I can see them dropping, two games pretty easily on the schedule. But yeah, if I'm a betting man, I'm probably putting it on them as much as I mean, as much as just as a college football fan, I would love to see Penn State put it together this year, be back at the top of the sport with all the talent they have. It's going to come down to beating Ohio State, Michigan, and I believe it's at Ohio State this year, home against Michigan for Penn State. To the ire of many, the Michigan game is not their nighttime whiteout game, which is, we can talk about Big Noon Kickoff and all that they've done with that, but regardless, we'll see how they end up doing. But the next one I wanted to look at regarding the ACC, you have two strong contenders right now, Florida State and Clemson. You could maybe throw North Carolina in that mix, but that might be a little bit of a reach
Duke,
in terms of playoff contention.
Duke.
Riley Leonard, Duke fans. I'm a big Duke fan as well. It'll be difficult to see them, running that table and doing that, but more likely to see two ACC teams in the playoff or none of them.
That's a really good question. The thing it's kind of a similar conversation with like, can they get over the hump? Because Florida State's hump has been Clemson. Can they beat Clemson? I don't think they've done it for I want to say 2017 or 16 was the last time they beat Clemson. It's
It
been a
was
while.
16.
Yeah, it's been a while. So that's the biggest thing for them is can they beat Clemson? And then you have, the LSU game to open. Those two teams are really evenly matched as we saw last year. I expect both teams to be better. And so, going back to the LSU thing, if LSU gets through Florida State, they still have to get, like you said, Alabama and Georgia, and then they get, I think, both Mississippi schools on the road.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it just comes down to if Florida State gets through LSU, that's one big marquee game that they got down, but can they get through Clemson as well? And that's in at Clemson, I believe, because it was
Yeah.
in Tallahassee last year. So yeah, that's kind of been their the monkey on their back is can they get through Clemson? And to me, they're going to have to. And now because the ACC doesn't have divisions, I think they might have to go through them twice.
Yeah.
Um, there's a very good likelihood of that happening, or at least beating them once at the very least. So I don't know, man. I think it would only be one. And I'm honestly going to bet the house on Florida State. I'm super crazy high
Yeah.
in Florida State this year. They have
Mhm.
so much talent coming back. They got so much in the transfer portal that nobody's talking about. That and not it might not be, the Caleb Williams and all the superstar guys that are going to make the headlines, but they just get everyone right. They get all the guys that just fit the program, fit the culture, fit the schemes, and all of their top guys last year were all transfers at some point. Um, and so I'm really excited to see what Florida State does. But Clemson, Garrett Riley as the offensive coordinator might fix a lot of problems on its own. So that battle is going to be really fun. But if Florida State's going to do it, they have to get through Clemson. There's no way around it.
Yeah. And you made the point about potentially beating them twice. We saw 2020 Notre Dame, monumental win in South Bend, couldn't get done in the championship game. They looked like they shouldn't have even been on that field with them, really. So we'll see. Yeah, if they have to get done twice, you would imagine that they would, based on how the two teams are kind of set up for this season. But yeah, when I first kind of posed this question, it made me think about, all right, in that two-team scenario, what would have to happen? I would imagine Florida State would have to beat LSU, lose to Clemson, and then you would imagine beat them in the ACC title game. Clemson then runs the table, loses in that ACC title game, sneaks in as a 4 seed. A lot of other things would have to happen to help that, of course, from other conferences. Um, but yeah, the zero-team scenario I think is less likely, frankly, just because I can't see both of those teams losing 2 games, and losing 1 game probably puts them in the playoff, I would imagine. So yeah, in terms of Florida State, I mean, I agree. I mean, everything is pointing towards this being the magical season. I am at least scared for their sake, for that they seem to be the team that's getting all this hype and everything should work out perfectly for them, and they might just be the disappointment, and it seems impossible that should happen with what they've got coming back, and I hope it doesn't, but we'll have to see. I think the other interesting part about that is that Clemson matchup is week 4 of the season, in Clemson, September 23rd, which is interesting to have that such a monumental game early season. Florida State opens with LSU, Southern Miss at home, then at Boston College, at Clemson. Not exactly the easiest opening slate in the world, especially compared to what kind of Clemson opens up with. But you mentioned Duke. Clemson's got to open up in Durham on Monday night, which is going to be a trendy upset pick, I would imagine.
That's what I'm making the pick for, yeah.
Mhm.
And then they get at Wake Forest and at Pitt, and those are two schools that, while they do lose a lot, those are not going to be easy outs. And then at Florida, I am. We'll get into this. I'm crazy low at Florida this year, but
Mhm.
um, and then Duke at home. Duke is going to be a really really tough team. They host Miami. I'm not high on Miami, but they should be better. Um, so yeah, the schedule is going to be tough for Florida State. I just, like you said, I don't think they're going to lose 2 games. Honestly, I think the only game that I'm like, I don't think they could pull this one out is at Clemson. I think if LSU was in Baton Rouge, I'm like, yeah, I don't think so. But because it's a neutral site game and they've beat them before and the teams are mostly the same, and I'm high on Florida State. I like them to win that game. But at Clemson would scare me as a Florida State fan. Anything else, I'm not so scared about.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier, you guessed that the last time they beat them was 2016 or 2017. Florida State being Clemson. It's 2014 last time Florida State beat
14.
Clemson. They have
Sheesh.
not, they never beat Deshaun, and ever since then they have been getting dominated. I mean, ironically enough, you look at the team's history though. Florida State dominates. I mean, as one would expect, the distant past for sure. But yeah, Clemson with, I believe, 7 straight wins in the series. So that's, again, you mentioned the humps to get over. That's kind of the theme of the episode. That is Florida State's for sure. You're gonna have to beat them once, you would imagine, as you said. But yeah, you touched on Florida. One of the ones that we also had on here. Billy Napier ending their second year. In this day and age of college football, it seems that somehow he is already on the hot seat, and you hate that for the guy because he's just stepped into this role essentially. But such is life in the SEC, especially at a program like Florida, that they don't they don't expect to lose less than 8 games pretty much ever. So yeah, with this season, losing Anthony Richardson, bringing in Graham Mertz, Florida doesn't make a bowl game, or they win 8 or more games with this roster.
Yeah, they're back-to-back 6 and 7 seasons, and they still lose four pieces of those teams. Like you said, Anthony Richardson is a big one. Ventura Miller at linebacker is a big one. Osiris Torrance on the offensive line is a massive one. That offensive line, man, I have no idea what that offensive line is going to look like this season. Your quarterback options are less than thrilling. Ask any Wisconsin fan. I don't think, Graham Mertz would be a guy to light up the offense. But, as is the world of college football, there were a lot of guys at quarterbacks last year who we were like, they didn't have a very good career at their first stop, and then they lit it up at their other stop. Um, so maybe Graham Mertz lights it up. I don't know. I'm not betting the house
Yeah.
on that, but it's crazy to think about. But they get at Utah. They play Tennessee really, really early in the season, at Kentucky, at South Carolina. They play Georgia, Arkansas. I am not sleeping on Arkansas this year. Might be crazy. That's probably a hot take that'll get, put on the bulletin board at the end of the year. And then at LSU, and they still get Florida State at the end of the year. Their schedule is brutal. I think they have a better shot of losing 8 games than winning 8 games.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm with you. It's tough to pick out 6 wins on the schedule, much less 8. And it's just, that's, I mean, if everything goes right, sure, maybe. But I mean, your swing games are at Kentucky, out South Carolina, and at Missouri, and I don't like your chances in any of those. I think you're going to be an underdog to Arkansas, Florida State, LSU, Georgia, Tennessee for sure. And, Tennessee hasn't won in the swamp since I think it's like 2002, 2003, something like that, back in the early 2000s. So that's a whole nother thing. And you opened with Utah, obviously, as you said, and that's going to Salt Lake and winning is going to be really tough. It did make me think, you mentioned Graham Mertz. It remembered how earlier this month, Florida wide receiver Andy Jean compared Graham Mertz to Joe Burrow and how, he could have a similar career path in moving to a different place and coming all the way over. Different scenario. I highly doubt Graham Mertz is going to be dealing with the same level of talent that Joe Burrow did at LSU. But
True.
again, who knows? We've seen it work out. I mean, Hendon Hooker had a decent career at Virginia Tech before, came to Tennessee, completely fixed. But they're all different scenarios. He had Josh Heupel in that offense. It's going to be tough, especially as you mentioned, the offensive line in front of him. The skill position talent, it's Florida. It's always going to be there. They're always going to have defensive talent and some studs over there. But this schedule is it's brutal. They have fallen. You could argue in terms of the SEC East and future outlook, maybe 4 to 5 years from now, they might have the bleakest because Vanderbilt is really looking like they're coming along with Clark Lee at the helm, and they might be fighting maybe for a bowl game this year potentially. And
Yeah.
you look at Florida, is your coach going to be on the way out after this year? You're working backwards. So I don't know. Yeah, I mean, if they all the power to them, if they win 8 games, that'll be incredible. But yeah, tough schedule. Pulling Arkansas from the West is probably the worst thing that could have happened to them. Well, outside of pulling Bama or LSU, or they already get LSU, but yeah, still going to be a tough schedule. And I guess follow up question: what gets Billy Napier fired? Is there, or is he? No matter what happens, this was a rebuild year, what have you.
I feel like the landscape of Gainesville is it's a bowl game or bust, honestly. Like I feel like with the history that program has in recent years, I feel like if you have 3 straight years of losing seasons. Now they did go to bowl games, but they lost. So 6 and 7, you consider those losing seasons. But um I don't really feel like it's a lot of his fault, to be honest with you, because they're recruiting okay. And they've got some talent on the team. The secondary looks really good. They got a two-headed monster at running back. But I feel like their biggest holes are really going to be what separates them. If there's no progress in the passing game, if the offensive line can't create holes in the run game and can't block, their defense got torn apart at the end of last season. If that doesn't improve, if there's no sign of improvement, I think if they go 6 and 7 again, they're like, hey, there's promise here. We've got some guys, we've got some building blocks to work off of. Maybe he gets another year, kind of a Chip Kelly UCLA situation a couple years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's just like, hey, we're going nowhere here, like in the schedule, they just get eaten alive by the teams that are superior against them. To me, I think it's probably a wrap for him. No, I'm not saying it should be, but I feel like
Yeah.
that's the way it is there, is because they have such a high standard that if they just get blown out by all the better teams and they don't look competitive, I think it's over.
Yeah, that's the biggest thing. I think is going to be looking competitive against your rivals. Tennessee, if Tennessee marches
Mhm.
into the swamp and wins by 30, the writing's going to be on the wall at that point, essentially, because
You
you're
might
going to. I mean, the problem is, you look at that schedule. You could start out with that Utah game, Tennessee early 1-2, and then I mean everything's kind of already not everything's lost, but you got to work your way back up. So it'll be interesting. It will be unfortunate, I think, if he does get fired after this season. Depending on how things go. But it's life in the SEC. You've seen Auburn rotate through coaches, Tennessee for 10 plus years rotated through coaches like that. It's what you're signing up for. Unfortunately, when you take that job, and that's why it's so highly paid.
can I make a hot take here?
Yeah, of course.
I think I think Tennessee smacks them, and that's it for Billy Napier. I think that'll
Really?
be it. Because
Hmm.
not only do they get smacked at home, but I think it's because of how heated that rivalry is and how, like you said, Florida hasn't lost at home to Tennessee in a long time. I think because of that specifically, and that's just the game that you don't lose at home and the way that they're probably going to lose it. And I would imagine at Utah, um, I feel like that might be it before it even starts. But again, one season plus 3 games, that's hard to say, hey, that's it for you. But um, I don't know, man. If they get smacked by Tennessee, it's to me, I don't see it getting better because, like you said, they get
Yeah.
Kentucky in a couple weeks, who I am not sleeping on Kentucky this year. I think they'll be better. At South Carolina, South Carolina's a really good team. Georgia, I mean, that ain't happening.
Georgia.
Arkansas, they do get them at home. And then it just gets so much more brutal from there. I don't know, man. I think this is the year that Billy Napier might get fired mid-year because it doesn't look good.
Yeah. Such is the life in the conference, and I mean, they'll have to. I mean, we'll see who they go for next at that point, because I mean, it's gonna be thin pickings for them, I would imagine, with how they've rotated recently. But last one we kind of had in the list, and I was really intrigued by this one because I have a name I need to throw out here, but Heisman, for all intents and purposes, at least in recent memory and most memory, has become a quarterback award. If a non-quarterback was to win it, is it more than likely to be a wide receiver, more likely to be a wide receiver or a running back, and why? I'll go ahead and start because the two obvious
I already
choices
know
I
who.
think we're looking at here, Marvin Harrison or Blake Corum. I'm going to throw out that I think Travion Henderson at Ohio State has a great chance to take the nation by storm. He's shown flashes, former 5 star. I believe it was 2021 where he first started getting major touches, and he had an incredible season, kind of splitting in the loaded backfield. He has so much potential. The Ohio State offense, new quarterback, you're going to lean on him more early, I would imagine. That's another name I wanted to throw out there. In terms of most likely, I'm still probably going to go Marvin Harrison because the voters showed the willingness to vote Devontae Smith in for a dominant season,
Mhm.
and Marvin Harrison is obviously more than capable of having a similar season to Devontae Smith. So again, betting man, putting my money on that, but Travion Henderson's the name I want to throw out that people aren't thinking about alongside Corum. Corum, nothing taking away from him.
Yeah, I'm glad you said Corum because I know he got hurt at the end of last year, but he definitely deserves to be in the running for the Heisman. I think he's probably the front runner at the running back position specifically. And then Marvin Harrison, yeah, that's a generational talent. But you brought up Devontae Smith. I think historically that's kind of an anomaly, right? Where he gets the looks more than his quarterback does in the
Yeah,
Heisman Trophy voting, because usually if a wide receiver pops off, generally speaking, that quarterback is going to be getting the looks because those pad his stats as well. But because that offense was just so damn crazy and loaded with talent, and that he was able to lead the country in like every statistic at Alabama with all the talent on that team, I think that was a big reason why. And you can say that if Marvin Harrison leads this group of receivers, against that competition with the new quarterback at Ohio State. Like to me, I feel like he would be the guy to win it. That's why it's kind of the same reason why I picked Jackson Smith and Najigba to win the Heisman last year, and then he got hurt. But it's a very similar thing again. Because he can put up crazy, crazy, crazy numbers. I think he could put up 2,000 yards this year. I'm not going to lie to you. I
yeah,
think if they didn't have so much depth and talent at the receiver position with, Igbuka and Julian Fleming. Um, I think he could easily put up 2,000 yards, but those guys will definitely get it. Cade Stover will definitely get it as well at tight end. Henderson and Mayan Williams will get looks out of the backfield too. So I think if they weren't so deep, that might be the only thing holding them back. Um, but I think historically speaking, running back is probably more likely. Um, I just think the talent, the top heaviness of the wide receiver position this year is probably um, gonna shine. But I like Corum as a Heisman. I don't even think he's a dark horse because Michigan,
He'd be a
playoff
favorite.
team back to back years. Yeah, he's definitely in the running, I would say.
Yeah. I mean, before I forget where exactly people were kind of putting him before the injury, but he was top 3 in that Heisman race, top 2 for a lot of people. He was right there. He had a great chance to win it if unfortunately getting injured. I think one of the other variables for Ohio State touched on a little bit is, the quarterback situation. Obviously, if Kyle McCord doesn't pan out and Devin Brown doesn't pan out, Marvin Harrison may not be able to put up those same numbers because he's just not going to receive the same touches. That being said, I'm going to go ahead and trust in Ryan Day. He's had a factory of an offense there for years now. It's a safe bet, at least, that they're gonna have at least solid seasons. Maybe not C.J. Stroud, Dwayne Haskins, Justin Fields-esque, but something along those lines. I go ahead and say the Penn State Ohio State matchup this year and watching Kalen King versus Marvin Harrison, must watch TV. Gonna have NFL scouts drooling, I would imagine, with those two going head to head. I think that's gonna be a lot of fun, and I do think that's the big thing for non quarterbacks to win this award. To me, is in your biggest games, how do you perform? And it's a big thing for quarterbacks too, but Devontae Smith in his biggest games, and obviously the playoff didn't count as well, but he dominated there too. But regular season, his biggest games, he was showing up and he was the best player on the field for the most part. Marvin Harrison has to be that. He was that against Georgia in the playoff. He'll have to do that again this year. Blake Corum has to be that way as well if they want to kind of take that away. Um, and yeah, you mentioned the quarterback situation with Devontae Smith and Mac Jones. Maybe it'll take someone having just in Mac. I thought people kind of not overhated but undervalued Mac Jones in college. I thought he was, incredibly efficient and accurate, but he wasn't flashy. He wasn't Caleb Williams. He wasn't Lamar Jackson. So if you're Marvin Harrison and he's not hoping this, but your Heisman outlook, you're saying, well, hopefully Kyle McCord's solid, efficient, completes passes, doesn't do anything that makes people say, wow, though, and he gets me the ball. And that's probably the way that works out. If it does, perfect world for him. But we'll see. At the end of the day, they're all going to value winning a lot more. Definitely, Lord knows Ohio State this season, after being, not winning a championship in 2014, their fans are probably getting a little restless at this point, just knowing how kind of impatient they can be. And the
Right.
playoff struggles, I think that is going to be their biggest enemy this season, because Ryan Day kind of needs to exercise some of those demons in the playoffs and finally kind of break that hump. But yeah, we'll see. It would be really cool, a great story to see Corum come back from injury and run the table like that and do it. But we did mention, Donovan Edwards also in that backfield. And Edwards in his own right is incredible. And how are you going to balance the touches between them and who's going to, kind of be the focal point? Is it going to be 1A, 1B, or are you going to have 1 and 2? We'll see how that works out as well.
Yeah, and kind of the same thing with Ohio State with Mayan Williams. How do they factor him into the picture as well? I would assume that Trevion Henderson, once he's back to full health, which I believe he is, he'll get the majority of the carries, as like it was before. Um, but yeah, I think the passing game is just going to be so prevalent with Ohio State, and even though it's a new quarterback with Kyle McCord, I think the fact that I think he was roommates and like high school teammates with Marvin Harrison Jr.,
Mm-hmm.
if I'm not mistaken. So they've got that connection down. And then, even if they throw Marvin Harrison Jr., stuff out in the flat or, just little short routes, the yards after catch ability, I think is what gets Heisman voters salivating a little bit because, if it's kind of the same thing with like a Jalen Hyatt of last year, which is why his win boggled me for the Bolitnikoff a little bit. He was really just a vertical guy, is
Mm-hmm.
what he showed. I feel like for me, if I was a Heisman voter, I would value what can you do after the catch? What's your complete route tree look like? Marvin Harrison Jr. to me has the most complete route tree of any receiver in college football I've seen in a long time. which is crazy because Ohio State, like you said, Jackson Smith-Njigba, Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson in just the last 3 years, and he's probably the best one. So, to me, the complete package is what puts him as a Heisman favorite for me. But like you said, if Kyle McCord's out here doing, no look passes and he's running
Mhm.
dudes over and, all these Sports Center top 10 plays 400, 500 yards, no
Yeah.
turnovers, all that sort of stuff, CJ Stroud sort of stuff, then yeah, it might be more of a McCord kind of award than a Marvin Harrison award. But I'd really like to see it be Marvin Harrison Jr. because that would be awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you briefly touched on the elephant in the room here is for a running back or wide receiver to win this award, you're going to have to outplay, to name a few, Caleb Williams, Jordan Travis, Michael Penix Jr., Drake May, Bo Nix, even throw in Sam Hartman, Jaden Daniels, Quinn Ewers, people giving Cade Klubnik a lot of looks, Joe Milton. There's so many quarterbacks this year that there's 4 or 5 that are already proven Heisman contenders, and there's about 10 to 15 that you could say that are potential, if things work out how they seem like they will. So it does seem like this is going to be a very quarterback heavy year, especially and also with kind of how the draft looks like it's going to look out with Caleb Williams already being the #1 pick and Drake May, a lot of people thinking going to be 2 or 3 already, a year out essentially from that. So we'll have to see how it plays out though, and kind of how it does the Ohio State passing attack works out, how Michigan's backfield works out, stuff like that. But yeah, I believe that does wrap it up for us here today. Thank you guys again for listening, watching. Once again, if you can just give the show a like, subscribe, follow, 5-star review, kind of all that stuff if you don't mind. And leave a comment as well on some of the topics today. Leave your answers to some of these hypotheticals, as well as kind of which of the remaining uncommitted teams in the ever expanding conference realignment is the most valuable, or you'd want to see in your conference the most. And again, don't forget to look forward to the first ever Transportal CFB preview magazine. Again, on sale July 5th, $9.99. It'll have obviously a ton of content previewing the 2023 season. Thank you again, Dylan, for joining me. You got anything you kind of want to shout out recent work, obviously outside of the magazine stuff, which is just pretty much everything at this point?
Yeah. The magazine's pretty much all we're doing right now. But if anybody's got any ideas for stories they'd like to see on the website, feel free to shoot us a DM or tweet at us or comment in YouTube. We're always looking for stuff like that. It's been a little lacking. If you keep up with the website, you've probably noticed a dip in the content, but the magazine stuff is at its heaviest right now. So we're definitely putting all of our resources, our skills, our talents into this magazine, and it's going to show. I promise you. The interviews that people were doing, the stories that people were writing, the Scatterboo one that Parker talked about, that's definitely going to be one to check out. Just awesome feature stories in this magazine. I mean, stuff you're not going to see anywhere in Athlon and Phil Steele. I'm telling you, the value and the quality of storytelling in this magazine is going to be top notch in the market for college football magazines. So definitely pay attention to that. Follow us on Twitter for all the updates and sneak peeks. We're tweeting a couple every week. Yeah, that's pretty much it for me.
Yeah. Yeah, I do. Definitely touching on that. I think this will be a magazine for the people that want to know, a lot of the stories behind the programs and behind the players, before the season starts. That's really, one of the big things you're going to get out of this, which I think is going to make it so unique. But yeah, in terms of some articles, I do, I believe kind of later this week, maybe early next week, I'm going to have a piece coming out. I was curious and I wanted to go through with how dominant Georgia and Bama have been and how they've been breaking all these records in NFL drafts. Can you make a complete roster out of active players from Georgia and Bama separately in the NFL? And then how do they stack up against each other? Very interesting findings, I will definitely say. And one of them certainly eclipses the other, but I will not spoil any more of that. That'll definitely y'all have to give that a read when it comes out. But it was a really fun piece to work on and stuff. But yeah, outside of that, thank you guys again for tuning in. This has been the Transportal CFB podcast presented by NoContextCFB. And we'll be back again next Wednesday as always for our weekly podcast. So look forward to seeing you guys then.